Hi there, I'm Professor Jonathan Singer. I'm the Vice Chair of the CAAT-Academic Bargaining Team, negotiating on behalf of full-time and partial load faculty at Ontario's 24 public colleges. And this is the third of a series of video on SWFs, what they record, how to read them, and how to identify and correct any errors in your workload assignment. This video will be looking at attributed time for evaluation and feedback each week and discussing how that time is calculated and recorded on the SWF. As discussed in the first two videos, our workload includes teaching contact hours, class preparation, evaluation feedback, and complementary functions, which are the work that doesn't directly relate to the classes that are being taught. In the first two videos, we've already looked at teaching contact hours and preparation. This video is devoted to looking at evaluation and feedback. The next video will look at complementary functions. And evaluation and feedback is time that's attributed for each section to evaluate and provide feedback to all the students in that section. And it is based on the number of teaching hours, the number of students in the class, and a factor that's based on the kind of evaluation that is required by the curriculum. This is covered in Article 1101E of our collective agreement. It's a little complicated, so I'm going to go through it in some detail, and I apologize if this is going to take a little bit longer. The collective agreement recognizes three different types of evaluation that we need to perform in the course of teaching courses. The first is called essay project and is identified as E or EP in our SWFs. And that covers essays, and also projects or portfolios, but also shorter work that requires interpretation to grade, work that might, for example, receive potentially part marks. It also might apply to work that, say, includes presentations or math or computer assignments that require detailed feedback. And for those types of evaluation, if every assignment in your class was essay or project type, then you would receive 0.03 hours per week, per student, per teaching contact hour. What that means is quite simply, in a 3-hour section, if it was 100% essay type of evaluation, then you would be looking at receiving 5 minutes and 24 seconds for grading and providing feedback to each student each week. The other type of assessment that we provide is routine or assisted, and that is identified as R or RA on the SWF, and that would include things like multiple choice or quizzes that have very, very short answers that don't require interpretation, where something is simply right or wrong. And it would also apply to evaluations where a grading assistant has been provided. And because that is grading that does not require much thought on the part of the grader, it receives half as much time for evaluation feedback, which is to say 0.015 hours per student per teaching contact hour each week. Or if you had a class that was just 100% multiple choice or routine and assisted grading throughout the entire semester, you would receive up to 2 minutes and 42 seconds per week per student to do all the grading for that week. The third type of grading that's identified in our collective agreement is called in process, and it's occasionally identified as either P or IP on our SWF. And that is grading that is done where the grade is determined and returned during the class period. So for example, if it's assessing a manual skill, the student performs the skill, the work is graded at, in the class, no additional time. The student receives the grade during the class. There's nothing that needs to be taken home. There's nothing that needs to be written up. It's just that the student would have the grade at the end of the class period. And because that doesn't require additional time outside the class, it receives very, very, very little time on the SWF. It receives 0.0092 hours per student per teaching contact hour each week, or for a 3-hour course, if all the grading was done through in-process evaluations, you'd receive 1 minute and 40 seconds per student per week for a 3-hour section to do all of the assessment for that week. But our work is often not 100% grading projects or 100% multiple choice tests or 100% in process throughout the semester. Often our courses and our learning outcomes and the curriculum requires a mix of these types in order to accurately and adequately provide students with assessments and feedback of their work in evaluating their success in the course. So there are some sections of the collective agreement which cover that. And the first one is 1101E24, which says, where a course requires more than one type of evaluation and feedback, the teacher and the supervisor shall agree upon a proportionate attribution of hours. If such agreement can't be reached, the college shall apply evaluation factors in the same proportion as the weight attached to each type of evaluation in the final grade for the course. So if, let's say, 50% of the course is being evaluated through multiple choice and 50% of the final grade is based on, let's say, a portfolio, then the breakdown would be 50% of the grading would be of the routine or assisted type, and the other 50 would be essay type. And it similarly says in 1102A2, the SWF shall include all details of the total workload, including teaching contact hours, type of evaluation feedback required by the curriculum, class size, and attributed hours. And that means that the evaluation types, the types of assessment that are required, are not simply to be determined by managers. This is partially an academic freedom issue as well, but it's also that the curriculum has specific requirements, and it's up to faculty to make to present the understanding of the appropriate types of evaluation that are required by the curriculum and the learning outcomes thereof. Now, we've talked a little bit about different types of evaluation and how much time each of them provide. And now the question is, how do they get recorded and captured on the SWF? How can you look at your SWF and understand how much time you've been given to evaluate your students and provide feedback to them? Well, this is what we call the front of the SWF, or above the line. It's the grid that includes, on the left-hand side of this grid, teaching contact hours, and then a section on preparation, which was discussed in the in the previous video, number 2. And this video, we're going to be looking at the yellow section for evaluation feedback. And in the next video, we'll be looking at the section to the right of the yellow on complementary hours. So looking at evaluation feedback, I'm going to blow this up a little bit. And just to take you through this very quickly, you'll see that there are 5 rows, one for each of 5 assigned sections. NUR 102, HTH 306 has 2 sections assigned, and NUT 205 has 2 sections assigned. And the first 3 sections are each 3 hours, and the last 2 sections of NUT 205 are 2 teaching contact hours each. Okay. And then in the first left-hand column of the yellow, the evaluation feedback section, it includes class size because you're being provided with time for evaluation feedback based on the number of students that you have. So please keep that in mind. This is why it's important that class sizes on the SWF are accurate. Otherwise, they will not provide an accurate measurement of the amount of time that your work will require. Now, the 3 columns to the right, listed E, R, and P, are where the SWF really gets confusing and where you really do need to understand and probably have somebody teach you how to read them. But ultimately, looking across 100, 0, 0, 60, 40, 0, 60, 40, 0, 40, 40, 20, 40, 40, 20. These numbers will always add up to 100, and what they reflect is the percentage of the course assessments that are in each of these 3 types. So for the course NUR 102, it is 100% essay project assessments. There's no multiple choice, There's no in-process grading inside during the teaching hour. For the 2 sections of HTH 306, 60% of the final grade is through essay project, through written work, and 40% through routine or assisted, like multiple choice, for example. And in the last class, NUT 205, the 2 sections there, they are 40% essay, 40% routine or assisted, 20% in process. Now, what I will say is if you have 2 sections of the same course, the evaluations should always be identical. These 2 sections should both be 40, 40, 20, and these 2 sections, HTH 306, should both be 60 and 40 and 0. You should not see different evaluation types within different sections of the same course. Now, each of these evaluation schemas provides a factor, which is to say a fraction of hours that are multiplied by the number of students that are multiplied then by the number of teaching contact hours. So all of which is to say that it will provide you with a total number of attributed hours for each of your sections, the evaluation and feedback total, to which your manager could then add additional attributed hours as needed. So if we look at NUR 102, you can see that for the 55 students in this class that are graded entirely using written essay project methods, that the professor is being attributed a total of less than 5 hours to grade all 55 students each week, with no attributed hours being assigned. In HTH 306, because there's less written component, less essay project component, more routine or assisted grading, that number gets reduced to 2.52, 2.5 hours to grade the 35 students in this section, and 2.16 hours to grade the 30 students in the second section of the same course, HTH 306 BB. And because the 2 sections of the last course, NUT 205, are both shorter in length, only 2 teaching contact hours instead of 3, that means that the evaluation time will also be reduced, because the evaluation time attributed hours are calculated by taking the factor and multiplying it by the class size, and multiplying that by the number of teaching contact hours. So if that number of teaching contact hours is reduced, then the amount of time for assessment will be reduced as well. And in this case, because both sections have the same breakdown of assessment type, essay, routine, and in process, and they have the same number of students and the same number of teaching contact hours. Therefore, they will both have the exact same number of attributed hours for evaluation and feedback, which is 2.38 hours per week for each section. And if you look down, you can see that this professor who's receiving this SWF is being provided a total of 14.39 hours each week to do all of the grading for all 5 sections. And that's it. No additional attributed hours have been provided on this SWF. So any work, any grading that this professor is doing beyond 14.39 hours is likely putting this professor into a position of unpaid overtime, volunteer labor that is unrecognized, uncompensated, uncalculated. And again, the collective agreement stipulates that no professor, instructor should need to work more than 44 hours in any week in which there is assigned teaching. And if one were to be grading beyond the number of hours attributed on the SWF, which is to say assigned as part of workload, then one would likely end up, yes, working more than the limit of 44 workload hours permissible in any week. Now, I mentioned the additional attributed hours column here. You will often find that that column on your SWFs is 0. That's based on my research into data provided by College Bargaining Information Services and provided by the college's 2 College Bargaining Information Services, Collective Bargaining Information Services, sorry. So there are variables that affect evaluation, and these are things that you or your manager or the workload monitoring group, according to the collective agreement, should consider when considering whether additional attributed hours for evaluation and feedback are needed. You might want to consider the nature and the level of the subject to be taught, including the type of program. Perhaps if it is advanced work that requires very detailed, intricate grading, perhaps it's written work of a significant length, or portfolios that include many, many different components. Perhaps the method of instructional modes and the requirements for alternate delivery, perhaps they create additional workload when providing feedback to students or evaluating their work. Perhaps students requiring accommodation might be a reason why the work of evaluating those students and providing feedback might not be adequately captured by the formulas contained in the collective agreement, which is why there is a column for additional attributed hours for evaluation on the SWF, precisely to capture instances like that. Perhaps the introduction of new technology could require additional time spent on evaluation and feedback, or a timetabling of workload, including changes to the length of the course, or the level of complexity in the curriculum. Any of those things, and perhaps many, many other things that I have not mentioned, such as, quite simply, the number of assessments that is required by the learning outcomes in order to adequately evaluate student performance of those learning outcomes. Perhaps that requires a particular number of assessments, and perhaps that requires additional time beyond what is attributed through the baseline formula in the collective agreement, which is an instance for additional attributed hours. In video number 5, we'll talk about how to resolve disputes. If, for example, you and your manager or supervisor may disagree on whether additional hours are required for evaluation. But coming up next in our next video, we'll be discussing complementary functions. That's it. You can go back and look at either of the 2 videos on SWF overview or looking at preparation time on our SWFs. Thank you very, very much for watching. Please feel free to share this with your colleagues. Thank you and take care. This video is intended only for informational purposes for OPSU CAAT-Academic faculty members and should not be treated as authoritative advice. Also, it should not be introduced in whole or in part in any dispute resolution proceeding. For authoritative advice on the SWF, please consult your union local or the union-appointed members of your workload monitoring group.